This is the NZXT H5 Flow RGB, and this is a deep dive video into the case with behind the scenes style where I'm going to show you the build process, the steps I went through to build in it, and some of the interesting highlights of the case. For example, I managed to fit a 360mm radiator in there, and you're not meant to be able to according to the specs. I'm also going to show off various other things of interest and highlights to it too. I'm going to do a full review and build guide, but I thought this might be a nice intro into the case. This case came nicely packaged. It had some really chunky polystyrene packaging around the outside, and then some cardboard, pretty heavy duty thick cardboard around the glass. You can see in the top and the front there, some protective covers. The thing that I noticed immediately though is actually on the underside of the case. What you can see here on the bottom is 4 very small rubber feet. This case doesn't seem to sit very high off the desk, which is fairly unusual, but there's also, as you can see, a perforated area up there. So there's no intake at the very bottom, and this bit sits flat there. So there's quite a lot of low profile design to the bottom of the case, which is fairly unusual. Usually you'd have large feet at the bottom to help with airflow, but the airflow should be assisted by the fact that we have this bit at an angle, which we'll see more of in a second. So now you can see, now it's out of the box, what this looks like. So at the bottom here, you'll see a perforated hole area along there. And then if I lift it up ever so slightly, you can see that it goes at an angle underneath and runs across here. So not only have you got the perforations there, but you've got it on down here. But the base and the back is completely flush with the desk, apart from these very small rubber feet. But obviously, you've then got a gap there where the airflow for the fans is meant to get pulled in. So you can put fans on the bottom here, which as you'll see also has holes in it. And then that will get drawn in from the front. As standard, it comes with one F360 single frame fan front mounted, and the suggestion that you could put a radiator there, 360, or up to a 280mm radiator on the top. One of the things that I find interesting there is if you look at the top, you'll see there's 3 holes, which make it look like potential for 360mm radiator or 360mm fan frame, but it actually says that you can't do that. So I'm curious to see what goes on there. The other thing that they've included is a single non-RGB fan at the rear, so you get one 360mm, which is essentially like 320mm RGB fans, and then one non-RGB at the back, which is a shame because obviously you've got a RGB case, RGB fans on the front, so you probably want to see RGB at the rear, so you'll have to replace that. So you've then got a fan that's going to be wasted, or you leave it in and just put up with it not being RGB. Obviously that's a personal choice. Spied an interesting issue with wobble on the case. How easy that is to see, but it wobbles around on the desk if you push it. So those feet aren't keeping it sturdy. Obviously it's empty at the moment though, so maybe with all the weight of the PC parts in there it won't be a problem. I've actually seen this before in other cases, a similar sort of issue, and then by the end of the build it wasn't a problem. I was curious, so if you do see that wobble, might not be a reason to panic. We'll find out in a little while. I was just setting up a shot to have the case spin round so you could see it in all its glory, and I noticed I could see the light of my YouTube light through the case because it's basically set up here so that on one side you've got this airflow panel with the perforations on one side there, and then on the rear you've also got the same perforations along the bottom here, obviously allowing for airflow for the fans and for the power supply unit and for anything else in there. So drives, for example, are also going to go in there. So you can see all the way through the bottom. There's a nice bit of air intake from various different angles, apart from that flat bit that's sitting perfectly on the desk. But I thought that was a nice demonstration of it because you can see the light shining through there. Obviously, once the power supply's in, that's going to block that area. But it's still pretty nice to be able to see the potential for passive airflow through the case there. Here's a demo that just because you can doesn't mean you should. So this is a mini ITX motherboard, which is a gigabyte one, B650 Aorus Ultra. And you can use mini ITX, ATX, EATX motherboards in here. And obviously you have the cable hiding bar, which I'll show in a second, which you can reposition, whether you use an ATX or EATX motherboard. You can put it in 2 different positions. But obviously you also have the option to go smaller if you want to, but this obviously looks ridiculous. I wouldn't recommend it. Just because you can doesn't mean you should do it. But I wanted to be able to demonstrate the different things that you could do with the case, at least to give you an idea of what it looks like. One of the interesting things that I felt about this case immediately when I see it is if you look at this angle, you can see there's enough holes here for 3 fans. And yet the case specs suggest you can't put a 360mm radiator up there or 320mm fans. Claims it's not possible. So, for the sake of sanity, I've got a F360 single frame fan here. And what I found is it looks like, in principle, you could indeed put that in there. You can see that it would go in. And from the top view, you'll also see that it looks like it will go in. However, if you are thinking about doing this, it's important to note this. This single frame fan design means that you mount your fans with screws in the 4 corners here and nowhere else on the design. So, yes, you could theoretically fit it in. You can see all 3 fans kind of fit. If you line up the holes at the back here, the screw holes fit into these corners. But the problem we now have, just despite the fact that this fan is mostly in that area, there's no way to screw the other holes in, because they're basically around here somewhere. It's very strange. I don't know why they've done it like this. I guess I'll find out more as I go into the case build fully. But obviously you couldn't use single frame fan design here because you'd only screw the fan ends at one end and not the other. So you'd have a bit of sag from this end. So although in theory it looks like it fits and fits quite nicely, it just won't screw in. That doesn't mean, I don't think, that you can't use anything. Here, for example, 320mm Lian Li Infinity fans. These uni fans obviously click together and allow you to mount the fans from multiple screws across there. So these should, in theory, fit in there. You can then see that you could screw in more of the fans up here. So we could screw in multiple different points here. You wouldn't be able to screw in the far end, but it wouldn't matter as much because it'd be secured here and here at this end, and then obviously on the other positions as well. So in this instance, you could quite easily use 3 120mm fans in this position. You could possibly even push it further to the left this way and have this fan fully in there, so you've got a good airflow potential there. It's a strange design that they've set it up this way. The idea, according to the specs, is that you could have a 280mm radiator in here, and obviously you can go for 140mm fans as well. So you could have 2 140mm fans in this position as well. You have options, but it's weird to have these 3 cutouts and then say you can't use a 360mm radiator and you can't use 320mm fans, because you can. You clearly can. Although whether you'll be able to easily when everything else is installed, I'll find out a bit later on. So the manual here shows the radiator and fan setup potential based on the specs. It suggests that you can have a 280mm radiator mounted on top as long as you have low profile memory, or you can have a 240, 140 or 120mm radiator at the top here. What you'll see though is that the fan support is only 2 120mm on top or 2 140mm. And yet, as you can see, and as I've shown, you have 3 holes here, so it looks like you should be able to have 320mm fans or a 360mm radiator. It seems like it might be an oversight in the design, like they were planning on allowing it, but then decided not to. However, what I think is actually the case is, if you think about it, with this design here, if you have a 360mm radiator installed in the front, the tubes are likely to be at the top here, which then means they'll push out this way, potentially blocking the 3rd fan in this port here. So basically the case isn't long enough. It needs a little bit more length. I'll find out later, because I'm probably going to front mount the radiator anyway to be able to demonstrate what you can do. I'm going to test to see if I can get a 360mm radiator in here as well, because I want to see whether you can, despite the fact they say you can't. It really looks like you should be able to, so I want to experiment with that and see whether that works, but I expect that's the reason. This gap just isn't big enough to support fans here and a radiator there. A random note here, if you're moving the cable bar, so I'm just moving this cable hiding bar across from the ATX positions, which has 2 screws here, a screw here and a screw at the bottom. If If you're moving it across to the left to make room into the EATX section, you'll see there's the EATX markings here. So you basically have to move them across each of these screws. But what I found is the middle screw that goes in the middle there doesn't have a hole to go back into once it's moved into that second position. So if you see that, then that might be a potential issue there, in that there's no additional screw hole on this bit, so it might wobble around a bit more. But now it's available to put EATX motherboard in there. There's an interesting part of the case design when it comes to the power supply unit here. Now, normally you'd take your power supply unit and you'd put the fan down towards the bottom of the case, facing where the intake ventings are. So you'd usually, in most cases, have some air vents down the bottom. But in this case, that isn't the case here, because it's just a flat panel. There's no holes, and obviously the feet mean it's flush with the desk. So what we actually have to do is do it the other way around, so that the fans are now facing towards the top. Now this is an intake fan, so air's sucked in through here, and then exhausts out the back here through those ventings. Thing with this is it's going to be pulling air from above, which obviously is going to be through this venting here, which is where we're also going to mount intake fans. And some of it will probably naturally get pulled through the holes here. Now this is a bit odd because it means essentially what you're doing is you're putting an intake fan into the case facing the wrong way, like this. And then at a later point, we're going to put intake fans on the bottom to pull cold air onto the graphics card. The problem is this is then going to be blocking that, and you've got two fans fighting for dominance in the same direction with airflow. So this is going to be trying to pull air that way, and the fans we're going to put on will be trying to pull air that way. There is a gap, however, once you seat it. Obviously, this is a 1,200 watt power supply, but there is a gap here. And also, obviously, this is kind of sitting further back towards the back of the case, and those fans will be nearer the front, and there will be naturally some air being pulled in through the holes that I showed earlier on through here as well, potentially. So here's what I was talking about. You can see from a slightly different angle, we've got the top of the power supply unit, and a slight gap between that and the bottom of the case where the fans will sit. From a different angle, you can see that again. You can see there's a nice gap here. This is obviously going to vary depending on the power supply you've got. The back on of the case, and you'll see obviously this venting is going to help because the air can get pulled through from here through towards the power supply unit, and there'll be some passive airflow that way. Flip it around and you can see from this angle as well the gap here, and then from this angle you'll see again the power supply is just down there, so part of it is actually from those holes, and then there's a gap there between what will be where the fans sit and below. Obviously, you can potentially fit some 120mm fans in there. So for demo, there's two Lian Li fans there. These will be intake, so set face down into the case to pull air from below. It would suck through from this bit, potentially, and from the rear for those holes. But obviously not from right below, like straight down. But there is this angled, perforated bit here. But my thinking is this is going to be fighting slightly with the power supply fan, which is also going to be trying to suck air. So you've got suction down and then suction up in different directions. So a bit of a weird design there. So I'm currently testing the Kraken Elite RGB, which is the 360mm model. And you'll notice I've removed the rear fan because what I found is if you try to install it with the tubes on the front, you can see it blocks here on the front F360 fan, so I thought we could do it the other way around with the tubes at the rear, like this, but then I found the back fan was blocking it. But what you can do is you can actually install it. So, despite the fact it says you can't, it looks like you can indeed install it this way around. So I'm going to do that as an experiment, because even if you look at the top of the case, with it in this position, you'll see that you can still access all the screw holes, apart from the two end ones. But you can access all the other ones for installing the radiator this way around. You have to ditch that rear fan, so you can't have a rear fan. But since that's an RGB anyway, and if you want to do this, you might be able to. So I'm going to see if we can do it in this build. and I've managed to top mount the Kraken Elite with the tubes at the rear. Obviously, we've still got the F360 single frame fan on the front. I've also replaced the standard fans that come on the Kraken with one of those F360 fans, just so they're a uniform design throughout. And a 240mm version here. But you can see it's possible to fit it in. So I don't know why they say it isn't, because you can. You can fit it in there. There's space on both sides. It's a little bit tricky. And obviously I can't now reuse a rear fan because it just won't. You won't be able to do it with the tubes here in this position. So that's one downside to doing that. But what I'm going to do is probably move this at some point to the front so I can show the position of that, and then put a 280 up there instead, just to show how that works. You can still access the back pretty easily. I managed to plug in the CPU fan connection, for example. There's not much room back there, but there is enough. And it's quite a clean setup at the end of it. So there, looks pretty good. So now I've shown this is possible, I want to briefly talk about the setup logic and wiring of it, because this is actually one of the most straightforward setups here in terms of the wiring. So the front F360 core fans have a cable out of them that goes to a 5V RGB header or an NZXT controller and a system fan header. I've got a separate wiring guide on these fans, by the way, if you want to see that, for the F360s or the single frame fans that work with all of these. But essentially, that's got two cables, one for RGB and one for power. That goes across all of those, and the same for this and the same for that. But the way I've done it is I have plugged in these front fans to the system fan header, which is at the bottom of the motherboard, and these ones as well. They're on the system fan header on the bottom of the motherboard. But the RGB cable is connected to the RGB controller that comes with the 360mm Kraken. This fan is also plugged into that in terms of the RGB, and then the power connector from that is plugged into the radiator, because the radiator has a breakout cable that runs from the pump head to the rear of the case. So these three fans are connected to that cable. This pump head is then connected to the CPU fan header, or AIO pump header, but in this case CPU fan header, because it avoids any problems with fan speed detection on the motherboard. And then you've got two USB connections, one from this and one from the RGB controller. This makes the wiring logic pretty straightforward. The fan speed of the fans on the radiator is controlled by NZXT cam because they're plugged directly into the pump head. But the rest of the fans are controlled by the motherboard itself, and the CPU pump is obviously also controlled by the motherboard potentially as well. So pretty straightforward wiring logic there. If you add in more fans, or if you weren't using the single frame fans, you might end up with more cables, which is one of the things I want to demonstrate in case people want to use the standard F140, F120 RGB core fans, for example. So I'm also going to show some other variations of what you can do by swapping this out for a 280mm Kraken and also putting a rear fan back in there. And then I'm going to change that and put this at the front, and then fans there as well. Actually, I might do that first because that might make more sense. I'm going to do some thermal tests on that as well to show the performance difference that top mounted will do versus front mounted, and some other tests too. But I want to show the various different things that you can do with it. So just so you can see the wiring at the back, which looks a bit chaotic back here, but I want to show the logic of it. You have the RGB controller, which is included with the Kraken Elite, which, as you can see, has three connections plugged into it. So it literally only controls three RGB fans. The front fans, the top fans, and the bottom fans. If you have any extra fans, then you obviously have an issue because you don't have enough ports to plug this in. This requires SATA power and a USB connection, but then it allows you to control the RGB lighting from NZXT's CAM software once it's connected up. The single frame fans have this flat connector on them usually, which you can see plugs into this connector here, which then splits into either RGB for NZXT or a 5V RGB header, which connects to your motherboard, and then a system fan header. So the ones that are plugged into the radiator are plugged in down here into a breakout cable, which comes from the pump, and then the other ones are plugged into the motherboard, as I've said. So the fans at the bottom here are plugged into the motherboard, fans at the front are plugged into the motherboard. So you've got RGB controlled from CAM, but the fan speed is controlled from the motherboard itself. So this is actually really straightforward wiring logic and pretty easy. Probably the easiest way to build this case, I expect, because you don't need a controller. So if you end up with any more fans, you're going to need an RGB and fan controller, which controls 9 fan power, and 6 RGB from this control box. And I'm probably going to need this in a minute when I change the setup. I want to demonstrate something quickly. I've talked about the wiring logic of the fans and the radiator already, but if you have this set up with the Kraken 280, for example, you get the RGB controller, which has 3 ports in it. Now, naturally, you can plug in the RGB connectors from this fan setup, like this. And then you have one extra RGB fan connector on there, which is the NZXT one. Now, theoretically, you could connect a F240 RGB core or an F360 RGB core or a single one of these, so additional one, or the rear, for example, you might want to install on your case. You could plug that in there. But then if you get any more, you then have a problem because you don't have any additional NZXT cables that you can use. Not an issue with this because you could plug these ones directly into the motherboard, but the better option is to not use this at all if you're putting loads of fans into your case, and instead opt for one of these, which is the RGB and fan controller from NZXT, which has both RGB and fan control in one controller. I didn't use this initially because it was more straightforward not to, but if you spend a little bit extra, you can get this controller, which then allows you to control the RGB lighting for 6 fans and the power for 9 in theory. But you'd only want to plug in one F360 core fan into one of these ports, for example. So we could use this in combination with the AIO. You could plug the RGB connectors into that, for example. So we can plug those in. And then you'll be able to plug in like an exhaust fan and the F360 RGB core intake fan into here as well, both for fan power and RGB. Then connect this to the motherboard with USB and then SATA power to the power supply unit, and then you can control it all via NZXT's CAM software. So this is a more logical way of doing it at the moment, especially if you're adding in loads of RGB. There's a really interesting problem with this setup. So this is the 280mm cooler, which I've now installed here. And NZXT recommends using low profile RAM for this. This crucial RAM is just about right size, but what I've actually discovered is the VRM shielding on the motherboard also has an impact. I actually can't move the cooler any further this way because the fans are jamming right up against the back of this here. The other problem I've got now that I've actually come to installing the cables, so plugging all the cables or running around to the back, is that I can't get them over the RAM or behind the RAM to hide them. You also can't go the other way. I'm going to have to remove the cooler so that I can run these cables through and plug them in. So I'm going to have to take the radiator off in order to reposition it. But what I find interesting is the fact that you can't... It will fit. It does fit in the specs that I've got, but it will only fit in this position. It was actually easier to install the 360mm cooler than it is this one, just because it's obviously bigger because of the nature of being a 280. The 240 you probably wouldn't have the problem, but the 280 is a bit fatter, and therefore it won't fit as easily. Pretty interesting problem that I'm now going to have to remove the radiator just so I can get behind it to put these cables in. So obviously I need to run these cables to the back, including the CPU fan connection I used to plug into the motherboard, and then the other ones need to run to the back so they can be hidden away. So I've now run the cables to the back, and what you can see is here, without it being screwed in, just the movement here. So you're limited to this. That's about as far as you can go to the left. And obviously the RAM, I mean, the fans are basically sitting on top of the RAM, so you need to make sure you've got low profile RAM if you want to have a 280 up there. This isn't particularly low profile, but it's also not RGB, so it doesn't sit as tall as some other RAMs I've seen. And then obviously you could move it this way a bit, but don't forget there isn't airflow potential there, so it has to be like this really. And as you can see, it's got quite a big gap here. Won't be as noticeable once it's set up. And it's not necessarily a problem, but if you want to push it towards the back more, you can't. So it's much easier to fill the space with the 360mm than it is the 280. So I've now completed the build in this format. Now it's a bit sort of janky. It'd be interesting to know what people think of this, because obviously I've got a F360 single frame fan at the front, which is what comes pre-installed. Then we've got a F240 fan frame at the bottom. And then obviously I'm using F140 core fans on the radiator, which come with that. And then a standard F120 fan with no RGB on the rear. So sort of a mix and match of various different fans. In an ideal world, you'd have a single frame fan on here and maybe not use that, or to use an RGB fan at the back. But I'm aware that not everyone has the budget to buy extra fans. You might not want to replace these fans. You might want to use them as standard. So let me know, would you swap those out? I'm really interested to know actually what the masses would do. I personally would try and get all the fans to match. So have single frame fans throughout if possible, or just go for all F120 fans so they're all the same size, or at least all the same design. So I'm kind of curious to see what other people would do, because that will help with build logic. Like, is this a good build logic? My next step is to swap this out for an RGB fan, because I think if you're going to have RGB, you're going to have RGB throughout. So the inclusion of a non-RGB fan makes no sense, and most people will probably replace it. But I don't know. Maybe that's an assumption, and maybe you wouldn't. I don't know. So now things have changed again. I've taken the radiator off, and we have the single frame fan on the front, single frame fan on the bottom, two 140mm F140 RGB core fans, and one 120mm, because you can only put 120mm at the back. I checked, and you can't fit three 120mm on the top because they just won't screw in. So you can get most of it in. But if you have a look at this, for example, basically you could push these fans all the way over here, but you then couldn't screw in the third one at this end because the bracket doesn't go quite far enough. So although you could fit it, you'd have one end of the fan wasn't completely flush and be able to screw that in. So that's one downside. So now my goal is to try and mount the 360mm Kraken basically like this. Which is now another option. Now I'm going to thermally test this once I've finished. But based on my previous experience, I'd say this is actually probably the better setup, because you've got intake onto the radiator. So you've got cool air going onto the radiator, cooling the CPU down, which will keep it at a better temperature. Got bottom intake fans blowing directly onto the graphics card, and then hot air is being expelled out of the top from these three fans. Therefore, you have cool CPU and a cool GPU. I've done some tests in another case where I found that is exactly the case. I'm going to do it again now with this build and see how we get on there and see if it does the same thing. I expect it probably will. So it'll be interesting to see. So as you can see, it's possible to do quite a few different things in this case and have a few different setups in there despite its compact size. As I said earlier on, I'm going to do a full review on this case later on with a lot more depth to it, as well as a build guide to show you all the steps for creating this if you want to. But from the initial look at the testing, what I've seen is mounting a 360mm radiator to the front gives you the best thermal performance. But I really like the design of the case overall. It was easy to build in, good cable management setup, reasonable airflow, and some very nice highlights for the money. So this is well worth considering, and hopefully this has given you some helpful insights into it if you consider buying. Check out the links in the description to find out more, including the specs on the build if you're curious. This has been the Provoked Prawn. Thanks for watching. You've made it right to the end of the video, you brilliant legend you. If you've enjoyed it, click that subscribe button, give me a thumbs up, and drop me a comment down below if you've got any questions. If you really enjoyed it, consider joining the channel and see the benefits of doing so. Check out these other videos. You might well find them interesting or useful. And most importantly, have a great life.